But what is so great about our community, as you well know, is that we're such a great volunteer community. And that goes back for generations. And to exemplify that, you know, Preston Ferris, and I'm already rambling too much, but he's judged more sheep and goat shows in the world than anybody else. I'm not lying, including some cattle. And when we had the boar goat got organized, and Sharon here was one of the pioneers, one of the youngest ones in that, the boar goat organization in the early 90s. You could get goats inspected. You could get goats inspected by certain people, like Preston Ferris. Well, these people came from Odessa. They had the grand champion of the second or third national show. But Preston wasn't here, so they called me, and I took him out to lunch, and I started mentioning about Sonora, because, you know, I don't know about y'all, but we always thought Odessa was way off. We just didn't relate. It's just 150 miles. San Antonio's farther. But he said, Joe Dandridge, he said, when I was growing up in Odessa, Texas, everybody knew that Sonora was the volunteer community. And then just the other day, did you see it on Facebook, where Sonora was recognized by this deal? Is the #1 small town in the state of Texas, just in the last 2 weeks. Have y'all seen that on Facebook? I can't turn it on. And so when I was asked to talk about the history some of the church, I naturally got this history book of Sonora, Sutton County, from 1887 through 1977. So that means some of y'all are going to have to start over. That's 45 years ago. And so we're not going to go through this, but how many here have this copy? That's one of them. If you're like me, you haven't looked at it in several years. I found some old markers in there. And what I'm going to tie it into is the stained glass windows in our church when it was built and finished in 1925. I'm assuming that those stained glass windows were put in when it was originally built. Somebody may want to correct that. And by memory, I'm going to try to, that's why I was referring to this book some. When we start over here, one of the windows behind the organ, it says, there's not a picture on it, it says, in memory of our mother, Mrs. Nanny Shirley, and by her sons. Well, her sons were old when I knew them. That was Edgar Glasscock. Kay Shirley's here. Where are you, Kay?
I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
Edgar Shirley. Edgar Shirley.
Yeah. Edgar Shirley. And in the older days, as you know, a lot of our mothers and grandmothers passed away early. So I just thought that was so great that we still have Kay Shirley Bosch here in our congregation. That's a lot of generations. As we come on around, but while we're on the subject of the organ, how many of you remember Edwin Sawyer? I've been to church funerals or church service at least twice where I honestly felt like God and Jesus was there, and Jesus rose up. One Easter Sunday, Edwin Sawyer, you know, John Tedford was our musician, and boy, he was great. But Edwin was asked to play the organ for that. And I, grew up around here. Miss Laura was the last person to visit with my mother before she passed away in '03. But I mean, Edwin Sawyer on that organ, oh, it was just magnificent. And then right behind there is a plaque dedicated to Gus Redmond. And to come back to the Shirley discussion, the other day I was saying, hey, I need some advice. It's all at the post office. I got to talk about the history of the church. And she said, Joe David, I'm on my way to El Dorado to see Gene Redmond. Giving more service to our needy citizens. But the point as I ramble here, and the reason I ramble, and I didn't know why, is I'm dyslexic, and it's hereditary. And when I was in the first grade up here, Miss Hildreth, they tied my left hand behind my back. I was ambidextrous and closely prayer. And it just passed me on. They didn't know what the heck to do with me. My sisters were reasonably smart till I got in the 6th grade, and then I started understanding things a little bit better. But you don't get over dyslexia. So that's why I ramble. I've got a good excuse. And so as we come on around to the next, to Jesus with the sheep. Now, isn't that appropriate for Sutton County? Sutton County, Sonora, Texas. And I haven't seen those emblems lately, but capital of the livestock world. What does that say? It's just amazing how our reputation is gone on for generations. But the most important thing that I want to say here today is we here in this room today, you may not be here for 4 generations, but everybody here has honestly made a difference. And when you think of history, you think of those old folks, that came here in a wagon train or something. But we are the pioneers, we're the people that are still here with that responsibility. I'm going to revert back to the church, then we'll go around the windows a little more. But when we used to be brought into the church, the 2nd or 3rd week that Reverend Mark was here, he came up to me and said, Mr. Ross, he said, I've been researching and you're the oldest member of the church. Of the one that is a member. Not the oldest in the room, maybe. And he said, Claire is pretty close to the oldest.
What year did we join?
But I gave this report at the Historical Society, and in those days, when you were 12 years old, Jody Minnie, we were the 2. And for 6 Sundays after church, we met with the preacher. It may have been Carmichael, I can't really remember. I didn't study this enough. But we just didn't come up and get baptized or going to church. Oh no. For 6 weeks we studied after church, and then we had to go to conference, which I continued for many years. Bruce Shirley and I went to the Methodist Church conference for a lot of years. As other people here in the room have too. Well, then we came back from the conference, and then Jody and I sat down there in the front row. And who was in the choir?
It's hot.
Yeah. Edgar Shirley, Joe Logan, D Word, that's why I call Word Hudson D every now and then. Cy Lefter, Priest Stevenson. Do y'all remember? And there were 2 or 3 ladies there. But I mean, they sang great. And when I was in the 3rd grade in school, because of them, I thought I was a good singer. I thought it depended on how loud you sang. But the school teacher in the 3rd grade, when she would keep me after school, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. No. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Oh, she said, son, you'll never sing. Broke my heart. She said, you're going to be the announcer. Well, it's amazing how the church has such an influence on all of us. It's just so great seeing these young ones participating in our church, in our families here. And I'm going to say something about my daddy. Betty died in 1969. But if you come outside here, there's a plaque that Linda's mother dedicated in memory of Mr. and Mrs. Robert and Betty Howard, who were just like my real grandparents. And I'm not going to sidetrack from that right now. But when I was chairman of the board for 3 years, well, Miss Allie, Linda's mother, she was on the executive committee too. And we had finally got grass planted out here. And then the Sunday school bunch started tearing it up. And so Allie came to me. She said, Joe David, we got to do something about this grass. And you got some credenums up here on top of the roof. My daddy was chairman of that when we built this parsies and those Sunday school classes there, is what I'm told. But as we come on around on the flags, you know, there's the Jesus with his sheep, which is very appropriate. It just has a date on there, 1947 through 1951. Maybe somebody can tell us what that refers to. Nobody's name. And then different Sunday school classes were there. And then we come on around, and there's Reverend Fisher. 2 windows with their name on there. I'm assuming they were I haven't studied this enough. I just got too sidetracked when I started flipping pages, but it's amazing the history in here of the different churches. But out front, you know, or you come up the steep stairs, it says built in 1924. This says 1925, it was finished. And I remember standing out there after church one Sunday with Glenn Richardson and George Wallace. And you know, this metal fence out here in front is dedicated in memory of Glenn Richardson. And Albert Ward and Glenn and Joe David, we were the three successive chairmen of the board there. We worked a whole lot. And of course, Rosalie had a whole lot to do. You know, every so often we remodeled this or repainted or take something like that. But I remember George and Glenn talking about they were in the first Sunday school class. And then later on, another day, when Jan and I were walking in this door to come on down, he said, Joe David, that church, that door I'll never forget. He said, your daddy stopped me and said, look me in the eye, son, and squeeze my hand. And taught me how to shake hands. Just like these youngsters will have memories at different times. The good Lord brings our community together, as we all know. I wasn't going to say anything about some of the different preachers, because I've already talked too long. I'll try not to say that again. But as Reverend Mark and we were visiting yesterday afternoon, it was amazing the interaction that he's had with our community or other preachers that have been here. And he commented that before he and his wife got married, which he said, we're going to get married in this certain town. But I want to get this certain preacher, to do the marriage. I said, who was that? Reverend Paul Terry. Great guy. And so that made me think, how many of you have been up on the third floor or even up on the roof? Good. You know, it's kind of hard to get your way up there. But Ty Lamper used to be a Sunday school teacher. And then Gertrude Babcock's the one that taught us about the Ten Commandments. You know, and the Babcocks came back here, if you remember, October the 30th of last year, to have their mother service here. You remember that? And Dr. Babcock was down at the experiment station, came there in 1920. He raised his family right over there in that blue house across from the dentist. The second house, in between the Glasscock and the Fort Allen house. A little more history. But I've got so many notes.
You're dyslexic, that ain't gonna help.
And so I'm going to start looking at these notes and going down them pretty quick. About a month ago, the good Lord, I just felt that urge. Joe David, you've got to go to Ozona and see Reverend Lee Lloyd. And I want us to pray for her. It's amazing how she had responded to her chemotherapy. And I got there early. They were closing the door. Got in there. Yeah, you know, that's a long church. Long aisle. And I started walking down there about the middle where some other people were. And Lee had already sat down with just a regular chair where instead of behind the altar or pulpit, where she could be sitting down while she gave the service. And she saw me walk down there, and she came down there, and we hugged each other. And people, well, I knew everybody there, but they looked kind of like, well, what in the world? And anyway, Kelly, there's two things. Her first comment, she said, Joe David, I'm so sorry I couldn't have been there for Albert Ward's service or Warren Hemphill's. See, her husband comes over on the weekend, But she said, I just can't drive to these other towns. But she was still keeping up with Sonora, what I'm getting at. And that was, and she asked about Cynthia and your mother when she could get her here. It's really been an inspiration to all of us to see them in our church. Yesterday, Reverend Mark found this picture. And he tried to tell me that this was Carol Love here in the middle. And on the back, it is Carol Love. And there's Joy Galbraith. There's Gus Redmond. But I want to set this out, or y'all pass it around. And here is Charlotte Wilson. Gracious Pete. I'm going to get back to Paul Terry in just a minute. You may remember as ranch families the name Welch. They managed some of the big ranches, their grandsons. Ross's uncle was Buster Welch, who trained the world champion cutting horse for Francis, his granddaddy. And James Kennedy trained another one. That was when the cutting horses weren't worth much money. But I'll never forget Reverend Ross Welch being in the pulpit, and those two beautiful young ladies, Allison Espy and Gail, came in the church. And there Ross Welch was, and he followed them down. We were so glad to see him there. And because Sammy Jean is still living. But that's history I'm talking about. But back to Paul Terry. He was gone. Paul Terry was a carpenter. And you know how sometimes building contractors come to little old Sonora and they don't, sometimes we don't think they're giving us too good a service. Well, the roofers were up there. And to get up on that roof, I've forgotten exactly, but it's not easy. So I went up there, and they were not doing a good job. I said, you're going to have to do this over. They said, well, we work for Reverend Paul Terry. And I said, well, he's not here, but I'm the one that signs the check. And you're not going to get paid. And so I looked down, and there was George Wallace and Jack Kerbo. I got back down again, Jesse, and got them to go up there so I'd have a witness. There's George Wallace's name again. And may we say a prayer for Martha. Wonderful lady. But it's a small world for Paul Terry to reach out to so many lives. As we're in the church here, you know, the altar, if you go down to the right-hand place, there's an old brass nameplate there. Now, I'm not going to call the names, but you know, that's why I mentioned remodeling every now and then. Daddy died in '69, so this was in the 50s or 60s. Two young men that were new to town on the Board of Stewards, and they're talking about remodeling, and they said, we're going to tear the altar down. It's dedicated in memory of Theo Sable. Mr. and Miss Brian Hunt, see, that's Billy Brown's aunt, Sable's aunt, and then his parents. And Daddy told them, I was told, over my dead body. And so, I want us to remember that altar needs to stay there. And I had a chance to take Nancy Brown when she was here for Doris Russlow's service. It was in this church. And Bill Sable down to show them that, and they weren't aware of that. They're, you know how we rolling around in different churches at times. But I'll never forget the look on their face. I want to get back to the Shirley family. How many of you remember Ruth? Great, great. But one is so inspiring. I want to say 40, but I think it was just 30. Okay, you correct me. She came here as a young lady, and then when she married and he quit teaching, every year, and the church would all go out there too. That first week of September or the last week of August, all the new teachers and the present teachers would go out to the Shirley Ranch or get to know people. 30 years. That's great. And it brought our churches together, our community, as well as the new teachers. But to get back to Joe Logan and Dee Word, when I came back as a young veterinarian and went down to the Parrish barbershop, Mr. Parrish and 4 of his sons there. And you had to wait in line. And so there I sat. And I told you about Joe Logan and Dee Word bringing me into church. And Joe Logan was getting his hair cut, and another old man, didn't know him. Found out that day, his name was West. He'd been a president of a bank in Del Rio and just signed his name with X. He couldn't write. He lived over here later on however you get to the football field, in one of the Glasscock houses. Remember Jamie Glasscock? We got 3 different families of Glasscocks. And then you remember the 2-story building there. Okay, so he said, Joe Logan, when all of us were stealing horses and cows, you would just steal a chicken or a rabbit to feed your family. Boy, I was sitting over there and I didn't know who that son of a gun was. And so later on, I got Leroy Bandit and James Barton. We were out at the steakhouse, and I said, who was this character? He said, well, let me tell you the rest of the story. Said, when you go out to Bud and Tommy Whitehead's, you look out over the draw down there. The road used to be there, the trail. There's a big water hole there. And he said, Dee Word was just a little boy over there where Lee Bloodworth lives now by the hospital ranch. Maybe 2 or 3 miles away from the house. But he'd go over to that water hole, and see what was going on. And his parents said, you're not going to do that anymore now. You can't go over there. But Mr. Word, Dee was over there, and he heard a horse and a couple of cows. So he ran over and he hid in a bush. He thought, this Mr. West pulled out a quarter and went over there and said, son, you never saw me here, did you? I'm not going to call some other names, but it was common to exchange livestock. But I hope you had the privilege of visiting with Marvin Shirley and Leroy Banyan about the history of so many different families. We're so grateful to have John Paul and Judy to come back to Sonora. He left after he was a younger Freeze boy, And somebody today was calling me Grassy. You heard that name? That's my nickname. Turney Freese is the one that gave me the name Grassy. Grass. Because on the football field, when I'd get knocked down or knock somebody down, I'd reach over and get a piece of grass. And then I was on the judging team for grasses. But that, Turney Freese gave me that name. Okay, and somebody today said Grassy to me. But I hadn't seen John Paul in a long time, but what year it was when he was still up, weren't y'all in Oklahoma, Judy? He came to the Fort Worth Stock Show, and I was judging the first meat goat show or boar goat show there, and there John Paul and Judy with their children, and got to say hello to them. It's funny how you remember certain things. And Sharon, have I already mentioned about your mother? Well, you know, I have trouble getting here on time, and that's the reason Reverend Brecken wanted me to talk. He can't talk very long, so he knew I could fill the bill this afternoon and talk a little longer. But when I first met Sharon and her sisters, they were ranching down on the Bracketville Road, 35 or 40 miles to Rock Springs.
30.
Okay. But Charles Ray and Pat would be at the Presbyterian Church, I believe, in Rock Springs every Sunday. And they were working. They're one of the 4 or 5 people that I know that didn't inherit a ranch, but saved their money and bought a ranch without some big deal. I can still remember Sharon opening the gate for me, those 4 little sisters, when I'd drive up there to test the bulls or pregnancy test the cows, and Sharon and put the pipe behind the cows for me. She's always been a worker. We're blessed to have her here in this community. But I asked Pat, her mother, I said, I just sometimes, since we've moved to the ranch, I don't get to church. Never forget it. She said, Joe David, it's all a matter of priorities. How do you plan your Sunday? As well as the rest of the week of trying to help other people. But to those of you that work back there, and I was hoping Nick and Irish Garza would be here today. When they first moved here, they were going to stay here 2 years. They've been here over 20 years now, you know. And that's what I think history's about, is those of us that are still here and going to be here, or maybe move on sometime. But this is where the history really comes. But back to my rambling, Paul Turney was John Paul's granddaddy. Grand Master of the State of Texas Masonic Lodge, right over there. Amazing. Had the privilege of being able to barely remember him and then read his turn. In fact, then Frances, my wife, was raised in Ozona. Her cousin, Ram Childress, was also the Grand Master. My point is to you youngsters here is, we're lucky to be living in these small towns. The ripple effect is great. Gene Wallace's family is not here, but I'll always remember Gene was very active on the Board of Stewards. And there was this discussion about the preacher. Please don't take this wrong. And I'll always remember what Gene said. We're here to worship the good Lord and not to be critical of the ministry. That's a whole lot in a few words. One time, Claire and I in 4-H Club, we received a state award at different times. But I went to, you remember the book, I Dare You, not about the drugs, but the Purina, Mr. Danforth. His son was Episcopalian preacher in Missouri and was a United States Senator. Mr. Danforth had this camp on Lake Michigan, where they brought in each state for some reason could send 1 or 2 young people. For 2 weeks we were there. And we got to sit there with Mr. Danforth, our group, 2 or 3 years before he passed away. And at lunch, he would ask 2 or 3 of us to stand up and briefly say something about yourself. And I remember Princeton was, and Harvard, they thought they were great, you know. One day, a young black man stood up. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't shouting. But it's really made a difference in a lot of people's lives. He said, I'm over here working on my master's and PhD. And he said, you Americans think you're Christians, but you're not. He said, I'm treated like scum. He sat down. I wish I somehow had kept contact with him. But that helped me at Texas A&M later. I want to point out how these little towns do have effect. And I apologize. But because of that man's statement, at A&M in about 1956, I was there at the Student Senate, and some of you may have read this. Greg Lascott wrote it up. So it's amazing they put on Facebook. They record now on the internet. This was in 1956, and we met there at our Student Senate to decide, are we going to go to SMU that next month to try to lead for integration or segregation in the Southwest Conference course. And when you get in vet school, you're not in the Corps anymore. And I sat there and listened to everybody, and it was obvious that of the 26 of us there, we were going to vote for segregation. But to go back about our community and our churches and our school teachers and our coaches in the 4-H Club, Jack Ratliff, the 3 Ratliff brothers, you remember that name here? Bill became lieutenant governor. But Jack was a year older. He was president of the student body at the University of Texas, Austin. Billy Scott, there he is, 8 years old maybe. President of the student body at Baylor, same time. I can still see my eyes shut. A young lady, tall, slender, Tommy Espy. She was president of the Pi Phi's 2B, but she was just a freshman. But I can still stay here standing by that character, Don Meredith, when we were there at that conference. And then I was vice president of the student body at A&M. And then Bill Ratliff became lieutenant governor of Texas, and Shannon Ratliff. And a lot of people don't realize that. They're from here. Shannon is still one of the lead lawyers for Exxon. I asked a while back, how's y'all's family reunions? And he said, we'll quit them because some are Republicans and some are Democrats. But there at that student senate meeting that night, everybody spoke about it. And the president, had his Corps uniform on and his saber and his boots. He said, all right, we've talked about this long enough. It went on over an hour. And the good Lord does things with us. We're all sinners. But for some reason I stood up. I said, I haven't spoken. Okay, Ross, you can talk. And I just quoted that man from Africa. Okay, let's vote. We voted 23 out of 26 to go to SMU, and it took about 3 years, and we students weren't as powerful as we thought, but we voted to lead the charge for integration in the Southwest Conference. That God uses us in different ways. What I'm getting at, we're hometown proud here. But this history book, Donna Hill, Carol Love, Claire, and probably some other ones were on that. They were the young squirts on that committee. Thanks to Bill Stewart. Bill Stewart never got enough credit. But back to the stained glass windows. This is my favorite. Are you the person that walked on past the man on the road that's way back? You can barely see him in that picture. Or are you the man, the lady that stopped to help the man down on the road? I remember when Honey Hicks and I gave the service one time here, and that was the point of our presentation, was that there. And that has the name D.B. Cushionberry. Well, Rex and Ben and Mrs. Epps, they were grandkids. No, they were the children of Mr. Cushionberry. And when you look at the goat picture down at the bank and at the steakhouse, that Angora goat that Mr. Basil Hawford bought for $2,000 or $3,000 back in the 20s, that tall man there, it didn't even cover his hat, was Mr. Cushionberry. And then we know how much the Cushionberries have done for this community. The experiment station, and Susan and Linda, I meant to get you to call Susan to see if she could be here, but I neglected that. But and then you come on back by the piano, and it refers to Reverend Mr. and Mrs. Dedication Fisher. So I assume they were the first pastors here, maybe when the windows were put up. But I want to encourage you to go look at some of those sometime, or think about how they've influenced us doing that back in the 1920s. Okay, a different church. I'm nearly through, and I apologize, but I speeded it up by reading some of this. You remember Beto Duran, don't you? The Duran family? Beto died at the nursing home there in Kerrville. But when we had his funeral here 2 or 3 years ago, time gets away, one of his sons flew up here from Houston. And it was a great pleasure to get to meet him. But I want to encourage us all to take that time this week, next week, turn around and go visit somebody at home or in a nursing home. You never know when they're going to pass away. And these nursing homes now, unless you know who's there for sure, you know, the ethics, you can't go in. You know, our mothers, like Mrs. Bobby Lou Myers' mother, you know, was up here 10 years with Alzheimer's. You know, people can't exist unless they have company. This and being polite is the best medicine anybody can get. But now you can't just walk in. You've got to kind of be on the list. Enough said about that. But anyway, Beto's son, he called me back. We visited a good deal. He said, Joe David, you know, I was raised in Sonora. What do y'all know about where the senior citizen place is over there? It hadn't always been used, you know, for the dining. I need to double check this again. He said, I was raised across the street. You know, his brother was on the other corner. And he said that building at first was the black people's church. I thought there was just a man that out Bond Road, the plumber, who Mr. Walter Pfluger bought across from the Wallace Ranch out on Bond Road. The plumber here was, way back there was a black gentleman, and then there was Elmo. But I don't remember having enough people here of that denomination to have a church building. But that's amazing. And that building has some structural problems, but we've got to put a plaque up there no matter what happens. And then it was the Hispanics Boy Scout, the meeting place. We've come so far. We've come so far. Well, we'll reach out to everybody in our community. In our ministerial alliance, thank heaven. And I think we can thank Lewis Allen for putting the word ministerial alliance into the way our churches work together. You can remember when we were younger, sometime. But can I tell maybe two more stories? All right. Do you remember Big Burl Davis talking about the other churches? Have you heard me tell the story when he was in his 50s and got baptized? He's a big guy. And Brother Elridge. Oh, is he? Brother Elridge, they tore down the old Baptist church. You had to go up those steep stairs. And the Baptists, you know, they really dunk them in the bathtub back there and swim in it. And Brother Elridge had some age on him, and he had his robe on. And they got behind the pulpit there, and Big Burl was big. And we kiddos, just like now, we'd go to different churches, and he laid him down, and then we didn't see him. We just, and flashing, and we're all just struggling, and finally they both got up, just all wet. And Bobby Scott and I, and some other, Bill Sable was there, different ones. We were just, it was hysterical. And I didn't think Brother Elvis knew me that way. But he looked up and he said, Scott, Ross, you quit that laughing, it's not funny. But that was true Christianity, that at that age, to become a Christian. You know. This is the last. You know, we all have memories of the grandmother in our church. Mrs. May Sawyer was the lady that I really remembered as she was we looked to her as her mother, and then later your mother, Alice. And now we have Iris Bradley and Mrs. Payton. Tom's not here still, is he?
Yeah.
I think? Okay. But I want to y'all to look at this and pass it around. See who that is. And I want to say, I don't think the Matthews and the Jennings are in this booklet. But Miss Rosemary got the biggest family here today. And I think we'll all agree, she's Miss a Personality. She's got that wonderful, cheerful smile. Did you read in the Devil's River News or the Livestock Weekly the letter 2 weeks ago that Chelsea Blackbird wrote? About as good as you can write it. I gave it to Gonzalez the other day at his second visit. And of course he couldn't read it then. But I said, this is what we want you Republicans and Democrats to think about. Mrs. Blackbird is a nutritionist, a lady of faith, and she talked about, the anti-meat people up here on the road 4 miles before you get to El Dorado. And then she gave the side of the beef, and then she thanked the ladies for presenting their viewpoint and said, let's all say a prayer for each other. And that's what we need, I think, honestly, in Austin, the other states, in Washington, D.C. I asked a month ago, Gonzalez, I said, at least, why don't we say a sincere prayer for President Biden? We somehow have got to get back to being an America based on Christianity. Thank you, and I apologize. But let's keep the history going. It's a great community.